is the if proposition. Well, let me just say this. If the Lord has been good to you, then you ought to serve him and say so. That's the if proposition. If the Lord has made a way for you and opened up doors for you that no man can close, you ought to serve him, and then you ought to be willing to say so. If the Lord has saved you when your back was up against the wall and you didn't know how you were going to come out the situation, you ought to serve him and say so. If the Lord has healed your body in any kind of way, maybe it was a pinky toe, but if the Lord has healed you, if he healed your organ, if he healed your mind, if you've experienced healing in any area of your life, you ought to serve him and say so. If the Lord has been a lawyer in the courtroom and you didn't know how that thing was going to turn in your favor, but some kind of way, I know how it was, the Holy Spirit got involved, and if you watched him be a lawyer in the courtroom, then you ought to serve the Lord and say so. If the Lord, I'm just trying to find some people who can reflect on what the Lord has done. If the Lord has protected your family from danger seen and unseen, you ought to serve the Lord this year and be bold to say so. If the Lord has given you peace in the midst of the storm, you ought to be bold enough to open up your mouth and serve him and say so. If he's been a doctor for you, you ought to serve him and say so. If he's been a provider for you, you ought to open up your mouth and serve him and say so. If he's been a healer for you, you ought to serve him and say so. If he's been your peace in the midst of the storm, you ought to open up your mouth, serve him and say so. I'm just looking for some people who've got a moment to reflect, to say, I know I did not get here by myself, but if it had not been for the hand of the Lord, if it had not been for the grace of God, if it had not been for the goodness of God, I would not be where I am today. If he got you out of some places, if he protected you for some things, if he broke an addiction off of your life, if he saved your children, if he clothed you and put you in your right mind, if he got you through the worst of your days and the best of your days, you ought to serve him and say so. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Let the victorious people of God say so. I'm just looking for somebody this morning who won't let Joshua declare it by himself, but will say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.